That is intellectually honest atheism. Yeah.
I would say that somebody who wants to appear intelligent but not.
Yeah, absolutely. That definitely happens with atheists. And with anyone. I think we all sometimes want to seem smart and do things to try to make that happen. So that's when I rejected atheism. Because I realized we believe in things that are not provable all the time. If you ask any atheist, does your mother love you? He'll say yes, but you don't deduce that through the scientific method. And so I realized we believe in things all the time that we can't prove. And so I was curious. So maybe there's something else. Maybe there's a spiritual realm. Maybe God exists. And so it was actually in one of those moments while I was still holding the baby that I felt moved to say a prayer. I'd never done that in my life. I didn't know how one goes about saying a prayer. And so I literally didn't know, like, how do you kind of go from talking to yourself to talking to God? So I made a few "is this thing on" jokes and a few comments about how I felt like I was talking to myself. And but then I did, I actually got down on my knees because I'd seen it in the movies. And I said a prayer, like, I forget what it was, but something like, God, if you're out there, like, please help me. And I waited. This was the moment I was really open. And nothing happened, no response. Waited a little bit longer, like, oh, maybe he's busy. Maybe there's a queue or something. It's like, when you're on hold with customer service. But nothing happened. And the problem was that I didn't understand what prayer was. I bought into those pop culture images, and so I thought of God as a wish-granting genie, basically. I'd rub the lamp, and nothing happened, and so obviously either God doesn't exist or something's wrong. The Catechism says, God calls man first. The living and true God tirelessly calls each person to that mysterious encounter known as prayer. In prayer, God's initiative of love always comes first. Our own first step is always a response. As God gradually reveals himself and reveals man to himself, prayer appears as a reciprocal call, a covenant drama. And through words and actions, this drama engages the heart. So what I didn't understand, that was in a way its own answered prayer, that I had finally felt moved to reach out to God. But because nothing happened and because I was confused by that, for about 7 months, any sort of spiritual life just languished. I just got busy. Joe and I were, busy with the baby. And I had actually kind of forgotten about it. And then I walked into a bookstore one day, and I came across this book called The Case for Christ by a guy named Lee Strobel. And it was really weird how I came across it. I'd never been in the religion section of a bookstore, but I literally just stumbled across this book. And I found it very compelling for two reasons. One was that he made the case for his belief in God and in Jesus Christ without quoting the Bible. It wasn't like, if you read 2 Corinthians, it says this and that, because obviously we atheists didn't believe in the Bible, so that's not compelling. But he just really laid out a really coherent case that spoke to me in my language. And the second thing related to that I found compelling about it was that I believed that he was an atheist. Because I'd read a lot of accounts by people who were supposedly atheists, but then they'd throw in something like, I felt weighed down by the shackles of sin, and atheists don't think like that, and so I would think, I don't think you've ever really been an atheist because you wouldn't be talking like that if you were. But this guy, he knew how to speak to me at my level. And so it really caught my attention because I believed that he really did have a true conversion. And the types of things that were in the book that really caught my attention, one of the most salient points for me was he did a series of interviews with a bunch of really heavy-hitting intellectuals. And one of them was a PhD Protestant philosopher with a background in chemistry named J.P. Moreland. And he made a very interesting quote, and I'll quote Moreland directly here. When Jesus was crucified, his followers were discouraged and depressed. They no longer had confidence that Jesus had been sent by God because they believed that anyone crucified was accursed by God, so they dispersed. The Jesus movement was all but stopped in its tracks. Then, after a short period of time, we see them abandoning their occupations, regathering, and committing themselves to spreading a very specific message, that Jesus Christ was the Messiah of God who died on the cross, returned to life, and was seen alive by them. And they were willing to spend the rest of their lives proclaiming this without any payoff from a human point of view. They often went without food, slept exposed to the elements, were ridiculed, beaten, and imprisoned. And finally, most of them were executed in torturous ways. And that last part was very interesting to me, that so many of the early Christians who claimed that they had personally seen Jesus Christ rise from the dead went to these horrible deaths. As Lee Strobel points out, some people are willing to die for beliefs that they think are true, but nobody is willing to die for a belief that he knows to be false. And I thought that was just so interesting, that there was no payoff for these people. Christianity, it was not a conquering religion. It was a religion where for the first few hundred years you could likely be killed for becoming a Christian. And I just didn't see any payoff from a human point of view of why this religion would spread. And J.P. Moreland made another point that I thought, along those lines, that I thought was very compelling. He pointed out that let's just look at it from the Jewish perspective. He pointed out that something cataclysmic happened in Jewish culture. That around that time they had 5 ancient social structures, such as keeping the Sabbath and animal sacrifice, and they believed that to abandon those things would risk their souls being damned to hell after death. Moreland goes on to say, now a rabbi named Jesus appears from a lower class region. He teaches for 3 years, gathers a following of lower and middle class people, gets in trouble with the authorities, and gets crucified along with 30,000 other Jewish men who are executed during this time period. But 5 weeks after he's crucified, over 10,000 Jews are following him and claiming that he is the initiator of a new religion. And get this, they're willing to give up or alter all 5 of the social institutions that they have been taught since childhood have such theological importance, socially and theologically. And so Moreland said, and I couldn't argue with this, you have to admit that something explosive happened in Jewish culture in first century Palestine. And his own explanation was simple. They'd seen Jesus rise from the dead. And so it got me to an interesting point, all this rational case for belief that at least something happened when Jesus Christ lived. And it made me ask, what if? For the first time in my life, I truly opened my mind that maybe God exists. Maybe he did become a man in the person of Jesus Christ. It was this just absolutely cataclysmic event for me that I had sort of thought maybe some kind of deity exists, but God, a personal God who seeks contact with us, and that he became a man. I mean, this was revolutionary. And so I went running up to Joe and I said, I have an announcement to make, because I'd talked about maybe exploring Buddhism or Islam or, of course, like many 20-somethings, it's anything but Christianity. That was at the bottom of the list. And so I went up to Joe and I said, I'm changing my focus. I think that Christianity is going to be my number one focus here. And Joe, who was raised Baptist and still considered himself kind of, even though he wasn't practicing, he still considered himself some sort of Christian, he just shrugged and said, of course you'd start with Christianity. And I said, oh, why is that so obvious to you? And he just shrugged and very casually said, there's not a single surviving world religion other than Christianity whose founder claimed to be God. And I thought, oh, that's a good point, because that's a really easy thing to disprove. Cult leaders are claiming to be God all the time, and it takes about 20 years, before they die, and it's really clear that they weren't God. And so how does that work, that this religion is still around when its founder made this absolutely outrageous claim? And so I bought a Bible. And I'd grown up in the Bible Belt, so I was really ready for my big Chorus of Angels moment now, cracking it open like I'd never owned a Bible. Here we go. And literally, I was not really familiar that there was the Old Testament and the New Testament, so I started reading at page 1. So I'm getting in the Old Testament. ooh, whoa, ooh, yeah. Because I assumed that Jesus would come in on like page 10. I mean, so I'm like, what is going on? And this is when I think I got Joe's interest, because I think he was kind of getting sick of me, because I'd be, knee deep in the Old Testament, and he'd come home and say something like, man, yeah, we're having payroll difficulties at work, and I'd say, oh, I know, I was reading the Bible. You should try killing a bird over a clay pot, taking red yarn and hyssop and dipping it in its blood. And he would just look at me and I'd say, Leviticus 14, I'm reading the Bible. Don't you believe in the Bible? And so you can see that this was not going well. For one thing, I had expected there to be some kind of call to action at the end, at least, like, okay, if you read this and you're convinced, then go to your local church and talk to them. But there were these letters written to these churches. It just was not the book that I had anticipated it to be. And the big thing was that I just didn't know, I had no idea how to interpret it, because I did not see a clear case laid out for a lot of traditional Christian teachings, like being against abortion or euthanasia or the death penalty or just any of these issues. I did not see a clear case made. And even some of the doctrines, based on my reading of the New Testament, I was not totally convinced that Jesus was definitely God. I knew there were some people in the early centuries who thought maybe he was a really inspired prophet, and based on my personal reading, that seemed like a pretty reasonable interpretation. I certainly didn't see a case for the Trinity laid out. And so I was so confused. And so then I would start asking people on the internet how to interpret things. And it was so bizarre. I would say something like, okay, I read in 1 Corinthians chapter 11 that women have to cover their heads in church. That's really important. And people would say, oh, he was just talking to those guys in the church in Corinth. You can blow that off. And then I'd say, okay, in that same letter, just a few paragraphs earlier, he said that our bodies are temples of the Holy Spirit. That was just for the church in Corinth? Oh, no, that's for all of us. And I kept flipping to the back saying, like, where's the answer key? Where are you getting this? Patrick Madrid, who's a great apologist, makes a great point in terms of the Bible not interpreting itself, when he gives the example of the sentence, I never said you stole the money. If you see that written, you actually don't know how to interpret that, because depending on which word you put emphasis on, it has entirely different meaning. I never said you stole the money versus I never said you stole the money. I never said you stole the money, and so on. And you can emphasize each word to get a totally different meaning. Mark Shea has a great book called By What Authority? And I think that is really the question that I came down to at this point, because people were more than happy to tell me what was right and wrong and the right way to interpret all these things in the Bible, but it went back to by what authority? I've got this guy, this woman, this guy over here, all telling me different things about the Bible. Who's right? Where's the authority above them to say who is right and who is wrong? And Joe suggested that I should get a concordance. Like that's evidently what he was familiar with. But that also didn't make sense to me. I didn't see a system that worked here, because this idea of like you got your Bible here and your concordance and your biblical encyclopedia all spread out on the table. First of all, it requires literacy. And widespread literacy is a very recent phenomenon. It also requires the printing press. Before the printing press, it would have been impossible for a family to own a concordance and a Bible and an encyclopedia. It probably would have been impossible for the average family to even own a Bible. It also requires time. People did not always have the free time that we have in our culture to pore over these books and get an encyclopedic knowledge of the Bible. And so something just seemed fishy about this to me. And I didn't know where to go, because I did not see a system that worked in this religion. But yet I'd seen enough evidence. I couldn't walk away from the person of Jesus Christ. I had seen enough evidence for his existence and had started to just sort of see some workings in my life that made me think I'm not ready to abandon him yet. But I didn't know where to turn.